Microsoft just released work queues for Power Automate, and this is the biggest upgrade ever. But what's a work queue? Imagine a line in the supermarket. Everyone in the line is waiting to check out. The people who arrived first or have special privileges, like a fast track pass, they're the ones who go to the front first. This is similar to work queues in Power Automate. Imagine a Power Automate workflow that reads 10,000 rows of data and then adds them to a system, a common Power Automate scenario. The best practice is to split the reading of the 10,000 rows and the system work into two workflows, and that's where work queues come into play. The two workflows are called dispatcher and performer. The dispatcher reads each record into separate queue items, and then the performer processes each queue item one by one. This way we can handle multiple transactions more efficiently, with better error handling and greater visibility on what's happening at each step. My name is Jensen. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional. Let's learn everything about work queues in Power Automate. To find work queues, navigate to the front page of Power Automate. Then you click this monitor, and there it is, work queues. Go click it. Let's create our first work queue. I'll click up here saying new work queue, and we can give our work queue a name. Let's call it numbers Q1. We can give it an optional description, and down here where it says item default time to live, we can define when our items will expire. Let's just leave it for now. We don't want them to expire at X minutes. So I click create. In a few seconds, we have our queue. That is right here. Let's add some items manually to the queue. I can go up here saying new work queue item. I can give it a name. Let's just give it a ID of 1001. The name is optional, but it's nice to have some sort of a recognition of the individual item that makes it much more easier when we have a lot of queue items. So our first queue item got the name 1001, and we can give it a value. I'll say 2,4, and that is actually two values. So imagine that these are two values coming into our queue item. We can add a processing node and an expiration date. Let's not do that. I'll just click create. If I want to inspect all queue items, I can see them down here, or I can click see all. That's much more better overview. Let's go add a few more items so we can work with them. I go up here and say new work queue item. Let's call it 1002, a new ID. And the value could be 7,4. Click create. Let's add one more. So new work queue item 1003, and we will give that 8,3 and click create. So now we have 3 queue items. Here we manually added the queue items, but in real life and later in this video, we will of course add them automatically, for example, from an Excel sheet. Here, I will go up to the URL. We need this ID because we will use that to identify this queue. So here I press Ctrl C on my keyboard just to copy it. I now have it in my clipboard. Let's open up a new tab and create a flow there. I can either go up here, click new tab and navigate to another Power Automate page, or I can simply just press Ctrl Shift K. That will duplicate the tab. Here I'll go up to create. There. Let's start by creating an instant cloud flow. And let's give it a name. So here we will start processing our queue item. So I'll call this numbers performer and saying manually trigger a flow and click create. That's it. Let's first add the ID of the work queue to a variable. So I go up here to new step and I'll find an initialize variable. Here, click it. We will call this work queue ID. it will be of the type string, and the value that is the one we got in the clipboard, I'll just do a Control V here in the value. Let's also rename this. It's much more easier to see what's going on in our flows. So I click the three dots, say rename here, and then we can call it Initialize variable work queue ID. So now we stored this value in the variable. Let's take an item from the queue. So I go down here to new step. I move into Microsoft Dataverse, and then I'll find a perform a bound action. I can also search for that without moving into Microsoft Dataverse. Just be sure that you pick the perform a bound action from Microsoft Dataverse. Here we need a table name, and that is work queues. So I click this drop down here. I can navigate all the way to the bottom, and here it is, pick work queues. We want to pick an action, and that is Dequeue. That means that we take the first item from the queue. We also need a row ID, and that is actually this work queue ID from up here. So I can click in here and use the variable just being created. So right now, what we do here is to initialize a variable. We use that variable here to take an item from the queue and nothing else. So what this means is that when we run this flow, I can just save it, it will just go into processing state of that item, but we are not doing anything and we're not finalizing it. Of course, we will do everything today. So watch this video till the end. Let's go test it. So I click test, manually, and test. We'll run the flow. That's it. And our flow ran successfully. If I go to the other tab here, and right now we haven't refreshed, so each of these items, those are queued. If I refresh the page, you will see that the first item is now processing. And again, we are not doing anything with it, and we are not finalizing it, so it will stay in the processing state. I go back to my performer here. Let's go into the perform a bound action. Go down here to body, Control A, Control C, we will copy everything from this body here. And one thing I want to show you, let us scroll a little bit down, is here in the body input, you can see the 2.4. Those are the input that we gave this queue item. We did it manually. Let's work with this queue item. So I click edit. But right now we just take it from the queue, but we also want to perform some sort of an action. Here I will find a parse JSON because the output that we get from here, we want to have it nice and handy. Click new step here, find parse JSON, and it might sound a little bit scary, parse JSON, but what we do is simply just taking this output up here and make it more readable so we can use it in the dynamic content. First of all, we go into the content. Over here in the dynamic content, you pick the body from perform a bound action. Then you say generate from sample. Press Ctrl V. That was the body from before. We click done. Now we can work with it. Let's also have some system work. This will be very simple, but imagine that this could be much more advanced. It could even be desktop flows. For now, we will just do a compose here. Click it. Then I click in here. And now I want to find the input from the parse JSON. So I can either scroll down or search for it up here instead. It's much more easy. So that is the input. And this input is the entire input. That is, we have 2.4, I believe it was, or 2.4. So what I can do here is to add some text to it. This is just to symbolize the system work. We will get more advanced later in the video, so stay tuned. Here I can say the data. And then we have the data got processed. So nothing too advanced. This is just to symbolize that our automation workflow does something. Here I can click the three dots again, say rename, and I will call this compose automation work. I always like to rename a lot of these so I can see what's going on, especially the variable actions and the composers. We also want to update the status of this queue item. Let me move back to the queue. As you see here, this is in a permanent processing state. I can even refresh to show it to you. And we want to say each time an item is processed, we want to set the status as processed. So I go back here, click new step. And again, you can move into Microsoft Dataverse, or you can simply just search for update a row. Here it is. Just make sure that you don't pick the Excel one, but pick the Dataverse. That's why I often prefer to move into Dataverse and find it there to reduce risk of errors. And then in the table name, we choose work queue items. So I scroll down here and find it here. The row ID that comes up here from this Parse JSON. And remember, the JSON parse was just that we said the output from perform a bound action. We want to do something with it so we can use it dynamically. And we do that here in Parse JSON. So this work queue item ID comes from up here. It gets parsed here, and now we can choose it dynamically. So if I scroll a little bit down here, we need to find the Parse JSON here. And we can, of course, search for it. It's right here, work queue item ID. So you can scroll down, or you can search for work queue item ID. That one we will use here. Then you say show advanced options. And here we need to fill in a couple of things. First, we have the processing result. Here we can do a custom text. Let's just say the item was processed successfully. And then we will give the status processed to finalize this item. So I'll say processed. The status reason, that will also be processed. Now let's click save. And we can run the flow once more. Again, let me recap. We take an item from the queue, we do a little bit of work here, and then we'll update it with a little log message and change the status. So if I click test here, we will run the flow in a few seconds. There we go. We can click run, done. And this is done in 1 or 2 seconds. There we have it. I can move back to the queue, and right now I will refresh. There you go. You can now see that our second item got processed, and we have a processing note out here. The item was processed successfully. And let's also inspect this compose automation work. You can see here the data 7.4 got processed, or 7,4. Let us now change the trigger. Right now we're sitting here and manually pressing a button. It could be nice that we will process these queue items as long as we have anything in the queue. And we can do that by changing the trigger over here. So I click edit. Instead of this manually trigger a flow, that means that we are manually starting it. Of course, we will never do that in a production setup, but it was nice for this tutorial. So here I click delete step. What we will do here is to find a trigger, move into the Dataverse, and here you will have that when a row is added, modified, or delete. What you will do here is click this drop down, and then you say if something gets added. And again, you will find the work queue items. So scroll down here. That's it. And the scope is the organization. That's it. Now we will save it, and we will click test. That means that it will listen for new queue items getting added to our queue. Right now, we have, of course, these static ones in our queue, and in a little while we will test it. So now we will go back to the queue, and let me just show you here that it's listening right now. Go back to the queue. Because we cannot use these, we have changed the trigger now. Now it will not process these, but it will process once we add them. So instead of these, let me go out here. We can say, I want to get rid of them, and let me show you how that is done most easily. That is done by navigating to the queue and see all. You can actually either selecting all of them, or for example 2. Let's just select all. And then you can say delete work queue items. I'll say delete. That means that we have emptied the queue, but be careful, this could be queue data. You don't want to delete it if not needed. So right now our queue is empty. Let's try to add a manually queue here. So I'll say new work queue item. Let's give it the ID 1004. Let's say 5.6 like this, and we will create it. So right now, once we have added this, we can go to our performer. This performer will start in 5-10 seconds. And while we wait for that, you have time to hit the like button of this video. This will really help me a lot. So please give it a like this video and subscribe to get all my new Power Automate videos. I'll fast forward to see this flow run. There you go. And we can see it completed successfully. If I go into compose, we can see that the data 5.6 got processed. And if I go over to my queue, there will be no change. It will say processed, and we can see the item was processed successfully. Instead of doing this manually, we will of course never do that in a production setup either. Maybe we would add an item or two, I don't know. But what we will usually do is to take the data from somewhere. That could be a database or an Excel sheet. Let's create a dispatcher. Dispatcher is a flow that adds data to the queue, so we don't have to do it manually. Again, I'll click these three dots here, delete work queue item, so we have a complete empty queue. I'll open up my OneDrive. So I go to my File Explorer. You can do this either in your File Explorer or in Microsoft 365 in OneDrive Cloud. And here I'll navigate to my OneDrive. So I'll simply just go in here, and this is my OneDrive. Let's create a new folder for this project. Feel free to use an already created folder. So I'll just say new folder, and I'll call this live. I'll move into the live. Now we will add the data that will get added to the queue. So I'll right click, new Excel. Please do this with me. You will learn so much. Let's call it sum.xlsx and open it. Here we go. First, I want to rename the sheet. It's called arc1, that is in Danish. So I right click and let us just say numbers. We need some columns. Let's just stick with the scheme. This could be literally any kind of organizational data, and usually, again, you will not create this Excel sheet manually with random numbers, but this is a good example, so we will stick with that. We will need to format it as a table, so Power Automate Cloud can read it. Mark your columns, and then press Ctrl-T on your keyboard and say My table has headers, and click OK. If you are in the OneDrive Cloud, you cannot use the Ctrl-T. What you will need to do here is to click here and then go over to Format as Table. That one is present in the cloud. So right now we have the table. Let's also give it a better name than table 1 because we can inspect the table name. What you do here is to click inside the table, go to Table Design, and instead of table 1 over here, let's call it Numbers Table. Now we will add some data to it. I want like 10 rows, so I drag down here in this blue corner like this, and the ID that will have the format 1001, 1002. Let's do this right here, and then we will have a number A and a number B. Let's give these random numbers between 0 and 9. So what I can do is I can say equal to random between 0.9, and if you're using semicolon, then you just pick a semicolon instead of the comma. So right now we're having these random numbers, and we can move them over here. But right now they are changing because each time I refresh this, this will get a new number. So what we do here is to mark all of these numbers, Control-C, and then we will say right click, say values here. And now they are static. They are not random anymore. These are the numbers that we have to work with. We're done with the Excel sheet, so I can save and let's exit it. Let's go out and create a new dispatcher flow in Power Automate Cloud. So again, to recap, we have our numbers, then we have the performer here, And now we will create a new flow. Again, I can go here, I can say Control-Shift-K, opening up a new tab. So, and let's just talk about the structure. We have the queues here. Now we will have the dispatcher here, and here we will have the performer. So that seems the right order. And again, it's just to make it easier for ourselves here in the development phase. Go click Create. Again, we will have an instant Cloudflow. We will just read the sheet by clicking a button, but we could have all sorts of triggers, such as when an Excel sheet is added to our folder, we will run this dispatcher robot, or once we receive an email with an Excel sheet attached, then we can run it. All sorts of nice triggers with filters. Let's call this one Numbers Dispatcher and choose Manually Trigger Flow and click Create. Here we have it. First, we need to get the data from the Excel table. I'll say New Step, and here I'll find a list rows present in a table. Go click that. The location, that will be OneDrive for Business. Document library, that is OneDrive. Now I click this folder over here to select the file. Remember, I created it in Live. Here, click this arrow, and I find my Some Excel book. I also need to pick the table, and we renamed it to Numbers Table. So right now we are getting the data from the Excel sheet. Let's iterate through it and add each row to our queue. So I'll say New Step. I'll find an Apply to Each here, and I'll choose the output from here, and that is in the value, that is a list of items. So I click here. And now we will go into add an action in this Apply to Each here. So I'll say add a new row again, and I will do that in the Microsoft Dataverse here. So I'm adding a new row, and I'll choose the table. That will be work queue items again. Scroll down and find it or write it. Then we have these things we need to fill in. The name of this row, we will use the ID for that. That was the 1001, 1002. And that was, if we go back to our queue, we used it over here when we added these new queue item. We used it as a name. But let me go back here. And in here, I'll just use the ID from the Excel sheet. That will be the name of this item. And again, this is nice so we can easily identify our queue items, say that we want to do some exception handling, which we will later, so please stick. We also need a work queue ID. Here I'll have a /, then I write work queues. I'll have a parentheses start and end, and inside these parentheses I'll paste in the ID of the queue. So I go back to the queue, find it up here, Control-C, go back here, and we will have it here. It will look like this. Click Show Advanced Options, because we also need to specify some input that we want to go into this queue item. And here, let's just take number A and number B, and we can also have the ID tied to it if we want. So I can say this, comma, number A and number B, say that we want to work with all these three in our flow. I'll do this. It's easy to comma separate it, because then I can easily split this array when we want to work with it later. I also want to say status reason. Let's put it into the queued state, because we want to queue it. Now we will click Save here. And let's go test this. And remember, this is the dispatcher. This will add the items to the queue. So I will say continue, I will run. And this one will get rather quick as well. That's it. If I go back to my queue and then I click refresh in my browser, you will see that we now have 10 items here. They are immediately getting processed, and that is because we have our performer. So we add them as queued, and now as soon as they hit the queue, then our performer will take over, which was this, and it will set the status to processed. And if I go into this performer, I go out here to the overview, you can see that 30 seconds ago, all these transactions ran. So far, so good. But let's imagine that we will face some errors in our automation flow here in the performer. Let us move in again. So I click edit. And let's say that we are processing something right now. We're only doing our work here in this single action. This could be 10 actions. It could be child flows. It could be desktop flows, which I will recommend also using these work queues with. So let's try to grab some of the data and create some errors. I mean, purposely errors. So let's go to start. I like to have a notepad open to make my expressions in, so I do this. So what do we want to do? Well, here we are taking an item from the queue in the performer and we're parsing it. I want to get the input out. Remember the input, let me go back to the queue. Let me pick see all. The input, that is this 1010 for 1. So I want to take the for 1 and let's just add them together for a simple automation workflow. Again, this simplified a much more advanced process. The process here is not important. We just need to understand the dispatcher and performer concept and what we can do with it. So this is the mission. If I go back to the performer here, I go back to the overview. Here it is, and let me just pick one of these items. Doesn't matter which, I click it. So we're going to work with some of the data from the Parse JSON, and this is one of the logs from the run. You can click this Parse JSON, and down here, let's just pick show raw outputs. This is how it looks. If we can see it here, we can see we have the body, and then we have the input. So what we will do here is to take the body from this Parse JSON, move into the input, and then we have this array here with our data. That is the data that we're going to use. Then we will split it to get the second and third item. And remember, an array is 0 index. That means that the first item is index 0, then 1 and 2. That is just programming, and we just need to get our head around that. So let's create the expression to take out this 1 and 6 or whatever the numbers are from the Parse JSON. It will look something like this. First, we will get the second item in the array. And I like to make these headers get second item in array. And then I'll do my expression. To get the second item in the array, let's just start by getting the actual input. So what we'll do here is that we'll say body, and then we'll have a parentheses start and end, and a single quotation mark start and end. In here, I give the name of the action. That one is Parse JSON, like this. So now I have the body. What I will do here is that I will say I will not have the body. I only need the input here. You can do that by having a question mark, a hard bracket, single quotation mark saying input, and a hard bracket end. So right now we are getting the input out, and that will give me this entire row. I only need the second item. So what we'll do here is to split this and take the second item. So I'll go down here and I'll say out here, I'll say split. I will have a parentheses start. I'll have a comma, 2 single quotation marks like this, and I'll say split by a comma. So right now, what this will give me is the second item. That is, this will not give me a second item. This will get an array of all 3 items. Now I want the second item, and what I'll do here is just say question mark, hard bracket, and again, this was 0 indexed, so I'll say index 1. That will give me the second item, which is 1 here. Similarly, I will get the third item in an array, and what I'll do here, just copy this, paste it in here. So to get the third item, that will be index 2, and that was just also of the header. So I'm creating these expressions here instead of creating them in the expression editor in Power Automate. I always go with that. I can easily save this to have it when I develop later or tomorrow. Although this comes out, you can see it's numbers, it will come out in a string format. So we need to convert it. And it's because we will add the two numbers together. That will be our automation work. So I go down here, then I'll say convert second item to integer. And what I will do is just go up here, Control C, I'll have an int, do like this, that will convert this to an integer. Similarly, I will convert the third item to an integer. So I'll say convert third item to an integer, move here, and that will be 2. Now we can add these two together. And I like to do it in steps because that makes it a lot more easy. So add the two integers to each other, and feel free to just write in the expression if you're comfortable with that. Here I'll say add, and then I can say the first one here. I can just copy paste it in. I'll have a comma, and then I'll have my second summand here, and I will have a parentheses end. That is my expression to add these two together. And again, you can see the steps here. We're getting the items, we're converting them to integers, and now we can add them together here with the add function. Mark this and copy it out, Control C. Then I go back to my flow and I click edit. What we will do here is to create it in the compose automation work. So instead of this, the data input got processed, I will delete it, and I'll go to expression and Control V, paste in my expression. I'll click OK. We now try to add the two things together, and that will work, but let's create some forced errors. So I'll click save here. That will save my flow and navigate back to the Excel sheet. That was called sum XLSX. Here we will have our errors. I'll just write in some random numbers, X, Y, Z. So what you see here is that we can process this, this will give an error. We can process this error here, process, error, process. So of course we cannot add 9 to Z, for example, but we'll see. Let's try to run it. So again, I can just close this Excel one here. So what we'll do here, this is the performer. We need to add something to the queue. We'll do that by the dispatcher. I'll go to my queue, and again, I just, for simplicity, let's empty it so we only have the queue items that we'll be working at right now. In a real life scenario, you will just have it all locked here in the queue, but for development for now, it's great. We have the dispatcher here. Let's go back to the overview, close this and click run. And now we're trying to add 10 more items to the queue. That will go well. But once we start processing them, 3 of these items will not go well, and that will actually prevent the queue items from reaching the process state, and that's why we need to do some error handling. And let me just refresh here. I'm sure it's over now. We added it. If I go to my performer, I can go back here. We can see that we have 3 of them failed. We knew that. And if I go back to the queue, I refresh it here, you can see that we have processed everything except these things here with an X, Y, Z in it. So that is not really nice. I really want to say this has an error, this has an error, because then I can easily see when I inspect the queue that we had some problems here. Go back to the performer. This was the last one here. I'll click edit flow. And here in the beginning, I want a transaction status because I will use that for error handling a little bit below. So say insert a new step, add an action. And here you will say initialize variable. Pick that one here. I will call this transaction status like this. It will be of the type string, and right now we will give it a null value. You do that by clicking here, go to expression, say null, and click OK. It's not invalid, just do it twice if it asks you to. So this value is null. That means that it's not empty, but it's simply not there. We will add things to it once we move further ahead. So after the parse JSON, and that is because I want to say, does this make sense? Let me just collapse this, but I want to say, can I add these two numbers together? If not, I want to log one transaction status here. And if I can, I want to log a success to this transaction status. And I can also rename this up here so it makes a little bit more sense. 3 dots here. I can say transaction status like this, click enter, and then do this. Now we can easily see what's going on. And here I want to introduce you for the concept try catch. This will not be a try catch lesson. If you want a full lesson on error handle exceptions here in Power Automate, I made a complete tutorial on that. Click the video in the upper right corner. Let's create a simple error handling for this, and we will introduce the try catch. So right after the parse JSON, click here, add an action. We'll find a scope. A scope is simply just a container where we can bucket in other actions. It will be ignored at runtime, this outer scope, but the actions inside will be performed. Let's go rename this. So this will be a try. Here we try something in. And what are we going to try? We're going to try this compose automation work. And let me just drag it here. And if this fails, we want to perform another scope. So I click plus here. I'll say add an action, and I'll find a scope here. And let's rename this to catch, like this. So now I want to say, if this one fails up here, I want to run this catch. I can do that by clicking these 3 dots, configure run after. I will not have it successfully because I only want whenever it fails up here. So I'll say done. Now this runs whenever we have an error up here. And I also want to say, I want to go to the updated row, whatever happens here in the catch. And let me recap this. If this goes well, this will simply just go down here because we defined that this shouldn't run whenever this was successful. Again, let me show you. Here you can see we untick that. So similarly, I'll go here to this 3 dots. And this is a very powerful way of handling errors. So whatever happened here, I will go to this update a row. Now also let's update the transaction status because we're going to use that here in the update a row. And let me show you where we want to have it. Here we want to have a processed or an error. Here processed error. And we're going to enter a custom value. That is the way where we can customize this on dynamic input. And this needs a number where 2 is a processed and 4 is an error. So we will lock these 2 numbers into our transaction status and use them down here as a custom value. Go up here. So whenever this goes well, we can go to the next action. When this fails, we know that this next action will not be performed. So we can click add an action. I can say set variable, set variable here. Variable. Here it is. And I want to set the transaction status, and I want to give it the transaction status to that was a success or a processed. Let me just rename this for simplicity. Transaction status 2, just so I can see what's going on. It literally means nothing. It's just for the overview. Similarly, here in the catch, I'll have add an action. Set variable. Again, I'll have the transaction status, and now I will give it the value 4. Click the 3 dots, rename. Transaction status 4 like this. Now we can use it down here in the update a row. Click it here. So what we will do is not use the processed, and instead I can delete this and instead use the custom value here. So if I go over here, now I want to use the transaction status. It might be that you can't find it out here. I cannot see it here. So what we will do is simply just go into expressions. Here you will say variables. Now we will just make an expression for that to call that variable. And let me just move in here. I will say transaction status. I always like to Control A, Control C to copy these because sometimes they do disappear. Now it's here, but I can also use it down here. Click this drop down, enter a custom value. And again, we cannot find it. So I'll just Control V, paste it in here. And now you can see it says an error. It's not, it's there. So now we have error handling, and let me show you how powerful this is. So while I save this, let's go to the queue. Let's clean the queue again. Again, we just do it so we can see what's going on here in our queue, because right now we have done some advanced exception handling. We will start our flow by running the dispatcher that will add the items to the queue, and then our performer, now with error handling, takes over. So again, I can just refresh here. This will take like 8 seconds, or it did before. Now we succeeded. I can go to my performer and go back here. And here you can see that we ran 8 minutes ago. So let me refresh this. It will take a little while. Here we have it. Now you can see everything succeeded, and that was because we made error handling. Yes, we have 3 errors in there, but that's fine. Our automation workflow is now able to handle those, and let's see how it looks in the queue. Let me refresh the queue. There you go. We can now see that this one here, X, Y, Z, now have the status exception. You can also have another processing node instead of this item was processed successfully. We can have customized nodes, but so far they got processed successfully, but there was a status of an exception. That is fine. That could be that it's an exception in our data. That could be the business department of our company gave us wrong data, and then this item was processed, but we just had some exception in it. Today we talked about exception handling and the try catch in Power Automate. Now you should go watch this video about exception handling and the try catch in Power Automate. If you want to network or solve problems with more than 7,000 automation developers, then you should join the I Love Automation Discord. It's completely free, and your invitation and guide is right up here.